Happy end of 2025. I hope everybody's holiday has gone well and that you're wrapping up the end of your year kind of in a slower, quieter pace. I wanted to take the opportunity to rant and rave about some of my favorite books from the past year. I read just over 100 and it's been a really successful reading year. I was just looking at my story graph, which is my favorite way to track my own reads, and I had more than 20 5-star reads this year. So I would count that as a pretty successful year. I tried to break it down by category. I tried to narrow it down as much as I could. It's a little bit over 10, but I wanted to talk through some of my personal favorite categories. I listened to a lot on audio this year. So I'll do favorite audiobooks, and then I have favorite fantasy, favorite historical fiction, favorite literary fiction, and favorite nonfiction, since those were the genres that I read the most of this year. So without further ado, let's jump into the list. I have 2 favorite audiobooks to recommend. The first one is Tom Lake by Ann Patchett. It's a great book on its own. This is a literary fiction story that explores one older woman kind of during COVID spending time on their family's apple orchard with her many daughters. I want to say 3 or 4 adult daughters. It's interesting. I don't typically like a COVID book, but this one really explored one aspect of COVID that I did enjoy, which was having a lot more time with family members to get to know them better. So these daughters are actually hearing their mom's life story and about a very brief time in her life when she was a somewhat celebrated actress for the first time. So it's a nice story in and of itself, but I think if I had read this in a book format, I probably wouldn't have remembered it very much. The difference here is that the audiobook is narrated by Meryl Streep, who has all of her acting accolades for a reason. She really made this story come alive for me. She brought a lot of humor and nuance and her own touch. I have no idea what the written experience is, but I have to say the audiobook experience was phenomenal. And along similar lines, my other audiobook recommendation is I've read the analog, like the written copy of several of the Thursday Murder Club book series by Richard Osman. These are a mystery series. It's about a community that's like a 55 and older community in Britain. There is a group of friends who live in this community who have formed a little club for themselves. There's, I'm sure there's like a gardening club. The community has some llamas that people are really interested in. But this is the Thursday Murder Club, and together they kind of stick their nose into local crimes and help solve mysteries. It's a very cute premise. I found that this edition of the book, of the series, The Last Devil to Die, was perhaps my favorite book in the series anyway. There was really significant and emotional payoff for a subplot that's been building book over book that I thought was really well done and was a kind of interesting and sensitive and well-written conclusion to this story for these characters. But additionally, the audiobook is read by Fiona Shaw. I think my understanding is that she has read all of the audiobooks for this series. This was the first one that I listened to on audio. And again, like when somebody stands out as an audiobook narrator, they can take a book maybe that you otherwise would have enjoyed, maybe that you otherwise wouldn't even have enjoyed as much, and turn it into a masterpiece. I thought she was phenomenal. A lot of people would know her from playing Aunt Petunia in the Harry Potter series. It took me a little while to kind of place where I knew this voice from, but she brought this really dry humor and delivery that I felt was such a perfect marriage with Richard Osman's writing style. This was a phenomenal book and a phenomenal delivery of it. Fantasy was by far the genre that I read the most of this year. I don't know why. I guess I just needed some escapism. I did narrow it down to 2 phenomenal picks. The first one was Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. This is technically a YA novel, but I will shout it from the rooftops that this is one of the best and most interesting and strangest books I've ever read. It's a duology. The second book is also phenomenal, but it's just the way that Laini Taylor writes is the way that I wish I experienced every part of my world. It is so vivid, it is so vibrant, it's gorgeous. The story itself is really lovely. It follows a young man who has spent much of his time working in the libraries of his great city, doing everything that he can to explore a lost city called Weep. It's almost like Atlantis in our world. Like, he's just obsessed with it, even though it's kind of considered a childish story, until one day an envoy from Weep arrives in his city and is asking for help. And Laszlo is the only one who knows their language. He's the only one who knows everything there is to know about this society. This story is just phenomenal, and it is dark for a children's story. I think that this is very well suited to adults, and you will not be bored as an adult reader reading this. It is so interesting. It explores, how society can recover from a very dark past without repeating the same mistakes. It explores the insider-outsider dynamic and how to forgive. It is just so profound and lovely, and just every single sentence of this writing, I wish that I could have just eaten or injected into my bloodstream. It was wonderful. The second book that I would recommend from this year is The Devils by Joe Abercrombie. The Devils is a religious horror story about a priest who is assigned the guardianship and leadership of the Vatican equivalent's small church of otherworldly creatures. So he is responsible for a vampire, a werewolf, a necromancer / sorcerer, just this really ragtag bunch. They're assigned a quest. My understanding is that there is a second book coming out as well. This was really funny. It was lovely. It was gruesome. I just really loved the vibes of this story, and I would recommend it to somebody, especially if you are familiar with the Catholic Church. I found it was especially funny under those circumstances. Similarly, actually, I would recommend Wake Up Dead Man, the new Knives Out story, as another Catholic Church adjacent dark horror mystery type story. Those two pieces of media for me this year were such a highlight. On to historical fiction. My two picks here, I realized, were very much dictated by how interesting I found the premise or the historical niche that the author decided to explore. The first one is The Wolf Den by Elodie Harper. This is a story that follows a young prostitute who is working in Pompeii. She's just a really interesting and passionate and strong-willed young woman who will do anything it takes to free herself from these really dark circumstances. I know, having it set in Pompeii, there may be one significant plot point that people are anticipating, and this is not a spoiler, but that's not the focus of the book at all. I think Pompeii is a really interesting setting because obviously it is so well preserved that there's just all of these different really vivid details of day-to-day life and what this would have looked like for our characters that Elodie Harper was able to include, and I thought they were included really well. If you're looking for something salacious, I really wouldn't recommend this. Instead, I think that this is a really clear-eyed and kind of sobering look at what it looked like to be a woman in the ancient world, to be a sex worker in the ancient world. It was brutal, and it doesn't really flinch from that, but it also covers, what these young women did and who they were to one another and how they survived, found joy, built relationships, and in particular in this story, how they could kind of use the very little resources they had to build influence and build a life for themselves. I just found this to be really, really well done. It's rough to read, but it is definitely worth the read. The second story I really loved was The Listeners by Maggie Stiefvater. It extrapolates from the historical fact that after Pearl Harbor in the United States, there were many diplomats from the Axis nations that were in the United States. So there were Germans, Japanese, and Italians who had been stationed in the United States as ambassadors or diplomats, or the nanny to an ambassador, the nanny to a diplomat, or the maid, or just these entire households that had been living and working in DC, who then couldn't obviously continue to be a diplomat in the country since they were at war, but essentially they were moved to luxury hotels. So this explores a luxury hotel in the West Virginia mountains that is then responsible for taking care of these diplomats and the very complex feelings that the staff of that hotel had about, essentially serving a luxury experience to people who are representative and emblematic of a nation that their country is at war with, and that their children or their neighbors or their husbands or, were at war with, and whose lives were on the line. This was really interesting. It held dramatic tension extremely well. It explored female leadership in a historical setting that I really enjoyed. There was a little bit of a romance in here, which I wasn't expecting, but was a nice surprise and well executed. And then the plot kind of focuses as well on a young girl who has some form of disability or is nonverbal, and what it looks like to be the German child of German diplomats who belong to the Nazi Party, but who want to protect their child with disabilities against what could happen to her when they return to Germany. So it's just really, really fascinating and well executed. And there's a magical realism element with the water in the hotel that I also thought was really well done. For literary fiction picks, I had two. This was again tough to narrow down, but I decided to recommend Intermezzo by Sally Rooney and Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. I have read several of Sally Rooney's books, and it comes down for me to whether I like her characters or not. I don't always find them super likable, and my hot take is that I particularly had a hard time reading normal people because I found both characters to be a little bit wishy-washy. This story follows two brothers who have a very significant age gap and have never really had a super close relationship after the death of their father, who was the primary parent for them. They are both grieving in their own ways, and they're both kind of trying to develop that relationship and prove to one another that they are adults and that they have kind of come into their own. Sally Rooney can be kind of a difficult read. She is definitely not one to shy away from difficult topics or taboos, and I think those were very present here. Both of the brothers are in relationships that could be seen as controversial. There's, again, kind of more age gaps going on and some kind of interesting dynamics. But ultimately, I thought this was a really lovely exploration of grief and sibling dynamics. And both of those are things that always really appeal to me in fiction. I just thought it was worth the read, even if some aspects of the story were still Sally Rooneying and making some complex relationship romance decisions. Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver, I'm sure, is on the top of many people's lists, and it is for a reason. I tried to read it several years ago when I was doing more of a social work type job. I was working with children who were very much forsaken by the social system, and at the time it was just really difficult for me to read since it was kind of what I was dealing with in my everyday life. But I had recognized it was a phenomenal book. Barbara Kingsolver wrote one of my favorite books of all time, which is The Bean Trees. So I really wanted to come back to this one, and I'm so glad that I did. Damon is just a really lovely character to root this story. I think it's a really incendiary exploration of poverty in the United States and the ways that the more things change, the more they stay the same. David Copperfield was Charles Dickens's critique of his society and the way that it treated its poor, and in particular poor children. And I think that Barbara Kingsolver did a phenomenal job of exploring that in more of a modern day US setting. Okay, I've been really good so far, but I am gonna cheat for my last category, which is nonfiction, and give you 3. I had a goal for myself to read 12 nonfiction books this year, and I met it, which I was really excited about. I thought it was gonna be really hard. When I try to sit down to read nonfiction, it never goes well. I feel like I'm reading the same page over and over again. But I listened to all of my nonfiction books this year on audiobook. So it just felt like a really long podcast about something I was interested in. And I just ended up adoring almost every book that I read in this genre. But I have 3 for you. One was Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. I have always said that I'm more of an indoorsy gal, and that remains true. I'm definitely happier indoors, but she is a botanist and a naturalist. She is a practicer of indigenous wisdom from the Potawatomi tribe. And I just thought it was such an interesting, profound, intelligent take on the natural world. It was a perfect marriage of kind of biology and knowledge of plants and the science behind them, and this spiritualism that I think is dangerous to divorce from the natural world, but is a little harder to get in touch with these days for some of us. I just thought it was really lovely. This is a strongly recommended book for good reason. The next book is Everything is Tuberculosis by John Green. I have been a Nerdfighter fan for a very, very long time. And I think John has just a really profound gift for cutting to the heart of an issue and projecting his own empathy to his readers and allowing you to really connect with the subject matter, no matter what the subject matter is. He brings kind of a radical hope to situations that I find really refreshing. I especially needed a dose of it in 2025, but he had a really well-researched take on tuberculosis as a historical disease and a modern disease. What it says about us as a society, that we could have ridded ourselves of tuberculosis a long time ago, and that we in wealthy nations that don't have as much of a tuberculosis problem or almost no tuberculosis problem almost haven't even heard of this disease that is claiming lives in other countries at a staggering rate. This was just a really kind of sobering take, but again, I think John does a wonderful job of bringing hope in when you most need it, having a clear-eyed view of the human condition, both in our selfishness and in our ability to take care of one another, and he always pulls me toward the latter. When I need it, this was a 5-star. And then the final book that I couldn't stop myself from including was Poverty by America by Matthew Desmond. I think everybody should read this book because there's a complex system of poverty in the United States. It looks like silent stress that people don't feel comfortable talking about with one another. And so I think this was a great way of keeping in mind how present this issue is, how consistent this issue is, and how close to me it is. You know, we know that we're living in an era of like radical income inequality, but what that's doing to the people who are experiencing abject poverty in the United States, Matthew Desmond does a phenomenal job. These 3 books I picked because each of them I read, I think, 6 months ago or more. These were earlier picks in the year, and they have really changed the way that I see the world, interact with other people, conceptualize my own life. And I still remember with a lot of clarity different vignettes or different reflections from each of these books, which is a good measurement for me, since nonfiction typically in the past I've had a really hard time remembering or walking away with takeaways. So that's it for me. These were some, but by no means all, of my favorite books of 2025. I hope that if you guys think any of those sounded interesting, you'll let me know what you think.